Okay, so have you ever felt like even if you can read in English pretty well, listening is like a whole other ball game?
Yeah, definitely.
Like the audio's coming at you way too fast and it's full of words you've never even heard before.
Yeah, if that sounds familiar, this is exactly the deep dive for you.
Right. So we're going to really try to take apart this problem of understanding spoken English and give you some really practical tips to improve your listening.
And we're going to look at a lot of sources to find out the best ways to improve your listening.
Exactly. So like you said, if you feel like spoken English is just a totally different beast than written English, and, you struggle with speakers talking super fast, or you just can't keep up with the main point of what they're saying, that's what we're getting into today.
Yeah, and that's what's really interesting when you're first starting to learn how to listen well in another language.
Yeah.
It's not about understanding every single word perfectly right away.
Yeah.
You don't have to get every single syllable.
Right.
The main goal at first is to really just try to get the main idea, just getting comfortable with the rhythm and the flow of the language. And that's really the first step.
Right, because I think that feeling of like constantly missing words or it feeling like everyone's talking too fast, it can get so discouraging.
Totally.
Because you fixate on like the one word you didn't hear and then you miss the next like 3 sentences because you were so focused on that one word.
Yeah, and it's like, if you think about learning a language, like learning a new piece of music. Yeah, the first time you hear a song, you don't listen to every note perfectly.
Right.
You're just kind of getting a feel for the melody, the tempo.
Yeah, the vibe.
Exactly. And language is similar.
Okay, so main idea first, that makes sense.
Okay.
So one thing we saw a lot in the research was this idea of repetition, but like with a twist to it.
Yes, active repetition.
Right, not just like passively listening to something again.
Yeah, and one of the best ways to do this is by listening to the same short audio clips multiple times, like little dialogues or short learner news reports.
Yeah, and keep it short too, nothing too long.
Exactly, and there's a specific way to do this.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that 3-pass approach that you were talking about earlier.
Right, so the first time you listen, just focus on getting the main idea, like we were talking about. Who are the speakers? What are they talking about? What's the main topic? Don't worry about the little details or any words you missed. Just get the big picture.
Okay, got it. So just the overall idea.
Exactly. And then on the second listen, you can add a little help if it's available.
Yeah.
You use subtitles or a transcript.
Okay.
That way you can see if you're right about the main idea from your first listen, and more importantly, you can figure out those words that you missed.
Right.
So reading the words along with hearing them really helps you understand.
That makes sense. So you're filling in those gaps.
Exactly. And then for the third listen, you take away the text and see if the audio was any clearer now that you've heard it and read it a couple of times.
Right.
So you're basically training your ears to pick up those words and sounds more easily. And that helps you avoid that feeling of getting lost, because you're getting better at catching more with each listen.
I really like that it's like you're giving your ears a workout.
Yeah.
So another thing that stood out to me was something that's actually really simple, but I think a lot of people forget about it.
What's that?
Adjusting the playback speed.
Oh, yeah. So many people don't even think about this.
I know, it's like a superpower.
Right. Most apps and websites that have audio or video let you slow things down.
And it's so useful because like sometimes you just wish you could make the speaker talk slower.
Right.
So how does that actually help with listening?
Well, when you listen at a slower speed, it gives your brain more time to actually hear the sounds and separate the words.
Okay.
And then you can pick up on the words that you would normally miss at regular speed.
So it's like training wheels for your ears.
Exactly.
I love that. And then as you get better at it, you can gradually speed it back up to normal speed.
Right.
That's such a great tip. Yeah.
Another thing is picking the right stuff to listen to. Because I know when I was learning other languages, I would just randomly pick something to listen to, and it would be like listening to astrophysicists talk.
Yeah, it's like trying to read an academic paper in a language you barely know.
Exactly.
Yes.
So where should someone start if they're trying to get better at listening?
Well, just like you wouldn't start reading in a new language with a really difficult book, you shouldn't start listening to really difficult things either.
Right.
It's better to start with podcasts or videos that are made for English language learners.
Okay.
They usually have clearer pronunciation and easier vocabulary, and the speakers talk at a slower pace.
Right, like Learner News or those educational channels.
Exactly. And then once you feel more confident and you're understanding more, you can move on to more challenging things, like stuff that native English speakers listen to.
Right.
So it's all about building up to that.
Right. And then you mentioned this earlier, connecting the content to your interests, because that's so important.
It is. So why is that so important?
Well, if you think about it, when you're listening to something you're actually interested in, you're going to be more motivated to understand it.
Totally.
Like if it's about travel or cooking or whatever you're into,
right,
you're going to pay more attention, and it's going to feel less like work and more like fun.
Exactly. So you're saying it's better to start with something short, like a documentary or a video about your hobby, instead of just jumping into like a long, boring news report about something you don't care about.
Exactly.
That makes so much sense, because if you're actually interested in learning how to make a cake, you're going to listen way more closely to the instructions.
Exactly.
Right. So we talked about listening to the same short audio clip multiple times, but what about listening to it again over several days?
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
It really helps you understand things more deeply, because when you listen to the same thing over a few days, it gives your brain time to really process the information, and you can focus on different things each time you listen.
So how would you break that down? Like, what should you be focusing on each day?
Well, the first time you listen, you're still just trying to get the main idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then the second time, you can start listening for more specific details, like, what are the key facts? What are the important pieces of information?
Okay.
And then by the third time, you can really focus on the language itself. Like, what are some interesting phrases the speaker uses? How do they pronounce certain words?
Yeah.
How does their voice go up and down to show emotion?
Right. So it's like peeling back the layers of an onion.
Exactly.
Get a little bit more each time.
Yeah.
And that means you don't have to always be listening to new stuff.
Exactly. You can learn a lot from just one piece of audio if you really take the time to listen to it multiple times.
Right. So you don't need to feel overwhelmed by tons of new material all the time.
Right.
So let's talk about accents, because that can be a big challenge.
Oh, sure.
Like American English, British English, sometimes it feels like totally different languages.
Yeah, it's tough.
So what's the best way to deal with all these different accents?
Well, the research suggests that you should just pick one accent to focus on at first. Whichever one you find easiest to understand, or maybe the one you hear most often.
Okay.
So that way you can get a good grasp of the specific sounds and the rhythm of that accent before you try to tackle others.
Makes sense.
And then once you're comfortable with that one, you can start listening to things with different accents.
So you're not trying to learn every accent all at once.
Exactly, because that would be too overwhelming.
Right.
So just start with one, and then as you hear more and more accents, your brain will naturally start to adjust, and you'll be able to understand them better over time.
Okay. And patience is key.
Definitely.
So let's move on to another tool that a lot of people use, subtitles.
Oh, yeah. Subtitles?
So they can be helpful, but sometimes people get too dependent on them.
Right.
So what's the best way to use subtitles without relying on them too much?
Well, watching movies or videos with English subtitles can be a good way to connect the spoken words with the written words, especially if you're trying to learn new vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
But if you always use subtitles, you're not really training your listening skills.
Because you're just reading.
Exactly. So it's good to use them sometimes, but not all the time.
Right. So what's a good strategy for using them?
Well, one good way is to watch a short scene with subtitles first, just to make sure you understand what's going on, and then watch it again without subtitles and see how much you can understand.
Okay.
That way you can test yourself and see if you're really understanding.
I like that. And you mentioned this before too. It's good to start with shorter videos instead of trying to watch a whole movie.
Right, because that could be too much.
So another active listening technique is taking notes while you listen.
Yes, taking notes can really help you focus and stay engaged.
But you don't want to write down every single word.
No, just jot down the key words, the main ideas, maybe some names or dates, anything that's important.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can find a transcript afterwards, you can compare your notes to the transcript and see how well you did.
So it's like a little test for yourself.
Exactly. And it also helps keep your mind from wandering, which can happen easily when you're listening in another language.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So note-taking keeps you actively involved.
Exactly. And another thing you could do is pause the audio every now and then and try to summarize what you've heard so far.
Okay.
You can either say it out loud or write it down, just a quick summary.
Okay.
And that forces you to really think about what you've heard and see if you're understanding it.
So if you can summarize it, you're probably on the right track.
Right. And if you can't, it means you need to listen again more carefully.
That's a good way to check yourself as you go.
Yeah.
So before we finish up, I want to talk about the connection between reading and listening.
Oh, yeah. They go hand in hand.
So how does reading help with listening?
Well, the more you read, the bigger your vocabulary gets, and the better you understand English grammar.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that makes it easier to understand what you hear.
So it's all connected.
Exactly.
That's good to know. So all that reading is not just for reading.
Right. It's helping your listening too.
So to sum up all this great advice, what are the most important things to remember for improving listening comprehension?
Well, the key is to be consistent and patient, and to use these strategies.
Okay.
So try to practice regularly, even if it's just for like 10 or 15 minutes every day.
Short and sweet.
Exactly. And make sure you're listening to things that are at your level, you know?
Right.
Don't be afraid to use transcripts or slow down the audio.
Those are really helpful tools.
And remember that improvement takes time.
Yeah, you're not going to be perfect overnight.
No, it's a process.
Mm.
So be patient with yourself and just keep practicing. And also go back to that idea of focusing on the main idea first.
Right.
Don't worry about every single word.
Just get the gist.
Exactly.
That takes a lot of the pressure off.
Yeah. And remember that every time you listen, you're getting more exposure to the language. You're getting more familiar with the sounds and the rhythm, and you're building your confidence.
So for someone who's really serious about improving their English listening, what's the most important thing to remember?
Well, the most important thing is to just be kind to yourself.
Yeah.
It's a journey, and there will be times when you feel frustrated.
That's normal.
Totally. But if you use these strategies, that frustration will be easier to deal with, and you'll start to see real progress.
That's so encouraging. And on that note, here's a final thought for you to think about.
Okay.
Next time you're listening to something in English, try focusing on just one of these strategies. Maybe slow down the audio or listen to the same short clip a few times and focus on something different each time. And then just see what happens.
Right.
What new things do you notice?
Yeah.
How much more do you understand?
It's worth a try.
Give it a shot and see what you discover. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah. Thanks for listening.